Welcome to Project Flux, the podcast that explores the cutting edge of AI in project delivery. Today we're excited to have Martin Paver, CEO and founder of Projecting Success, join us. Martin will delve into the significance of data-driven project delivery and the hurdles that we face in its implementation. He'll also share his career journey and the inspiration behind Projecting Success. We'll discuss the limitations of traditional lessons learned data and highlight the crucial roles of government and the private sector in advancing data-driven project management. Martin will introduce the Project Data Analytics Coalition and its mission to create an open source ecosystem for project professionals. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter. You'll find the links in the show notes. And please follow or subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast player to stay updated with our latest episodes. So stay tuned for an insightful conversation with Martin Paver. Let's dive in. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Martin Paver, the CEO and founder of Projecting Success. Martin is a visionary in the field of data-driven project delivery and has been recognised in the Data IQ 100 for his contributions to data analytics in project management. With a career spanning 3 decades, Martin has led billion-dollar projects and established innovative initiatives like the Project Data Analytics Community, the Project Data Analytics Coalition, and Project Hack, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through this interview. His mission is to transform project delivery through advanced data analytics and AI, helping organisations achieve greater efficiency and success. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks a lot, James. It's a pleasure.
And the pleasure is all mine. And I think one thing I missed from the introduction is probably mentor as well. You're mentor to many people, and I include myself in that. And really, I wouldn't be doing any of this if it wasn't for you, Martin. You really kind of opened my eyes up to this new world. And as you said, I think I swallowed the pill. You really have inspired many, many people. So it really is a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
So, James, we can't do this alone, can we? It's a really, really big, ambitious, big, hairy goal that we're sort of aiming for. It can't be done by one person or one company. It's got to be done by all of us pulling together. So the more people we get involved in this, the quicker we'll go.
Absolutely, and that's the challenge, isn't it? It's getting people to lean in, as you say, and sort of join the club. But I think I've certainly seen a change in the last year or so, or 18 months, especially since ChatGPT came out. But before we get into kind of the conversation about where you think sort of the tech is going and how things are moving in the project delivery world, can you just tell us a little bit about your career journey and how it led you to form Projecting Success?
Certainly, James. So I started off, I'm a software engineer by background. I did the MOD's graduate training scheme, and then I got into project management, and I worked in the MOD in loads of different places. So the best gig I had was out in NATO in Munich. Love that. Wow. So that was 4 years out there working on the Eurofighter simulator. So I kept seeing that sort of projects were delayed time after time after time. And then I'd been around 20 years in the MOD, and I thought, it's the same stuff coming around. So you can see all these sort of things going to hit you, and we don't avoid them. We just stumble into the same things. So it used to frustrate me. So I left there and I went to a company called Lloyd's Register, which is one of Britain's sort of biggest charities. So I was there setting up their nuclear business. I did that for a couple of years. And Fukushima came along, and that sort of blew up the nuclear industry for a little while, sort of literally.
They can't blame that one on you.
So I then moved to a company called DBD, which is a small company doing nuclear consultancy. Did that for a bit. They put me into Aldermaston, where I led $1 billion project there. And at that point, I sort of thought, so where next? Mm-hmm. So at Aldermaston, I spoke to a couple of guys and said, why don't you go and set yourself up by yourself? So I looked into it all. I thought, yeah, it's worth a punt. So I then set up Projecting Success.
What year was that?
It was 14. So the same time as that, I also set up i3Works with a couple of other guys. So i3Works is another consultancy that's in the project controls space. So in 2016, they want to take the sort of business down the project controls route, and I wanted to take it down the data route. So I left because I wanted to sort of pursue my dream, and I didn't want to do the project control stuff anymore because it just seemed to me that we were just feeding the machine. So I didn't believe in some of the stuff we were doing as a profession, right, with the project controls. So I sold out of that business. That gave me a bit of cash, and that gave me some sort of options in my life. So I paid my mortgage off, and I got some choices. So I then invested a bit more time into projecting success, and I pulled together 20,000 lessons learned from across loads of organisations, including government as well. So I put in a lot of freedom of information requests, which made me really unpopular. And I did that intentionally because I thought we're not learning from these lessons, so I need to do some research into it. So if I was a university doing that, it'd be fine. But because I'm a sort of private company, they thought is up to something.
Yeah, that's a pretty kind of gutsy move to do that. Did a lot of people warn you off putting those freedom of information requests?
So people said to me, just be careful because you get a reputation as some sort of terrorist, trying to be subversive and trying to sort of destroy government. And that was never my intent, right?
Yeah.
So my intent was to discover the facts so I could work out what we need to do to improve it. So basically what I thought was we could pull together all this lessons learned information, start to apply some data science to it, and then we'll come up with some secret sauce. And to be honest, it was a dead end. And it's a dead end because that lessons learned data is not good enough.
So having got it and gone through the trouble of getting them to release it to you, you then discover it's not very good.
So basically it's an abstraction of an abstraction. And because it's an abstraction of an abstraction, it loses the context, it loses the detail, it loses all the impact statements. So it's very difficult to leverage that through a machine learning lens, and I think that's the biggest problem with it. So what that then said to me is we need to do something different. So what I then did in 2017, I realised that we needed to pivot to this data-driven project delivery. So I went to see Network Rail, the NHS and various other organisations, and they looked at me like I was mad. So I thought, well, I'm not going to change this. It was me and this other chap at the time called James Smith, a really lovely man who was there in the early days.
Yeah, I remember.
So employee number 2 after myself. And James and I said, right, if we want to do this, we can't do it by ourselves. We've got to sort of create a movement. So that's what we did.
Yeah.
So we set up the Project Data Analytics community. It's grown to way over 10,000 people now. We run events in partnership with the Project Data Analytics Task Force that you kindly chair now. So we run hackathons and loads of other things as well. So it's all about getting the word out there and trying to inspire people that there's a different way of delivering projects. And that's what we're trying to do. Really,
and that's how I came across it, through the community. I remember lockdown specifically, looking around and seeing your posts. I mean, you're very active on LinkedIn, Martin, as well. And, coming along to that community, it really felt like there was a buzz, like there was these people that knew something that other people might not know. And you could feel the movement building. And then I remember you talking, 4 years ago or so, it must have been around COVID time, you were urging people to not look up, taking it from that film that was released around the same time about the asteroid heading to Earth. And that was all around don't look up in regards to data-driven project management. But because of what's happened in the last sort of 18 months or so with ChatGPT, do you feel vindicated now by the current trends in project delivery that people are starting to wake up to this?
So some people are, some people aren't. So they still think it's a passing fad. It doesn't affect me, it affects the data team. Yeah. I'm seeing a split in the industry as well, and especially within government. I'm seeing they're becoming inward focused. So what they're starting to do now, so not all parts of government, but, there's sort of significant proportion of them are now starting to say, so what we need to do is get the data team to go and sort of come up with a load of products and a load of sort of dashboards, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I find that deeply concerning, James, right? So there are these pockets that start to move, but they're going to do it to us, not with us. So what's going to happen to all these project professionals in the future once this technology gets better and better and better? Because we're dumbing ourselves down.
Yeah, it's the easy answer, isn't it? I feel like people say, yeah, I'm doing the data stuff. I've just got a team working on it, and let the project professionals carry on doing what they're doing. But to me, that's just a short-term solution, because then you're creating a bigger problem in the long term because the skills won't be there.
So it's bigger than that, I think, James. It's the mindset that goes with it as well. The mindset is, if you know about this stuff, you know how to make it work, so you know what to ask your supply chain for. So with some of these government clients as well, I'm seeing that they're coming up with various tools, but they don't own a lot of the data, right? It's not in their sort of purview, right? They don't see that data.
Mm.
So a lot of these big projects, loads of that data is sat in the supply chain, and they're saying, well, let's contract for it. So we'll get our hands on all this data. And it's like, so what's the end objective? So you can get your hand on all the data, but what do? Do you then take all that data from company one and give it to company two? It doesn't all stack up, right? It doesn't stack up because you then get into contravening competition law and sort of NDAs and commercial confidentiality agreements, whatever. So I just feel that what we're doing is jumping on the bandwagon and starting to get involved in some of this data analytics stuff, but we're not thinking it through about the long-term implications of it.
So what do you think the answer is?
So I think
What direction would you like to see it go?
So a lot more collegiate between government and the private sector, right? So government is there. Keir Starmer said government is there to serve. So I had 20 years of government and I felt that I was serving, right? I was there to make the world a better place, etc. So it's there to serve. It's there to make the profession better. It's there to drive down the cost of projects and to increase project delivery performance so we can have more infrastructure. So, James, I live a few miles away from the A303 and I've just seen that they've turned it off today.
Yeah, I've seen those announcements.
£6 million has been thrown down the toilet.
Yeah, it's depressing, isn't it?
I just find that really bad.
Mm.
So I think together, what we need to be doing is working together so we can sort of prevent those things happening in the future. And that needs these end-to-end data pipelines, which we've not got at the moment. So we then need to start to pool some of the data through the vehicle where we can do that. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that, as you know, through this concept of a data trust. So that's a non-profit vehicle that works in the interest of everybody. So that can work for the private sector, the public sector. We've got another one going for the oil and gas sector. So where we're pooling data for decommissioning projects in the North Sea, there's 4,000 wells that need to be decommissioned at the cost of about £45 billion. Taxpayers got to pick up at least 50% of that.
And that's a brilliant use case, isn't it? Where you've got a repeatable objective that's happening that you can truly kind of leverage and learn from the data of the previous projects.
It's massive, James. It's massive. Plus, as well, the incentives are fully aligned because it's about driving down a liability, basically.
Yeah.
So it's fully aligned except for one persona, and that persona is if you're a contractor working on those decommissioning projects, then you want to keep the secret sauce for yourself so you can win more decommissioning projects, right? So that's the only persona where your incentives are not aligned.
Yeah, and how do we change that then? If that's the kind of the missing link, how do we kind of change that mentality from the contractors?
So it's a strong client, I think. So you just need a strong client saying, look, this is bigger picture stuff. If you play nicely, then I'll give you lots of contracts, right? If you want to do this for your own ends and develop your own products and get your own data out of it, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, and this concept of people thinking that they've got some inherent value in their own data, I think they're missing, like you say, the bigger picture. That if you grow the pie, as you say, I know you've used that analogy before, then there's more for everyone, right? But we live in this, especially in the construction world, and I think in most project delivery professions, this kind of everyone walks around with a kind of attitude of scarcity, that there's not enough to go around. Therefore, well, I've got to keep hold of my little pile. And I think that's the main thing hurting the adoption of some of these data-driven initiatives.
And that's really sad in my view, James. Really, really sad.
Yeah.
So if we could drive down the price of these projects, we'd probably have a lot more of them. We'd have a lot more sort of infrastructure projects. So back in 2012 time, the UK was like a world leader. It had got things like the Olympics going through, Crossrail was looking good at the time, etc., etc. And more recently, with HS2, plus they just turned off the A303 and all this other stuff, we're getting to a situation where our crown's sort of slipped a little bit. So what do we need to do to sort of regain that lead? That can't be done by one sort of single organisation. It's got to be done by all of us working together.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it needs vision, it needs ambition, and it needs leadership.
But you talk about these projects that have, they've been canned or they've gone over budget. Oftentimes, the people in charge would have been given fair warning that these things were going over budget, and it wasn't necessarily about the data. It was about the culture, or this kind of feeling that I know better than the data because I've got 30 years in the industry, therefore I know better. So how can we change that kind of culture around getting people to trust the data and stop using their gut? Because it's proven now that using your gut is not good management technique. I know you do a lot of that in projecting success with your training initiatives.
So what we try and teach people to do is to follow your nose with the data, right? So if the data is there, it's an undisputable fact a lot of the time, not always, because people can manipulate the data, but if you take it from source systems and it's coming out of an invoice, for instance, then it should be non-disputable, right? So I know you've been looking into blockchains and things like that, but you can get to a situation where it's a fact, right? It's a sort of undisputable fact. So what we're trying to do is to train people to think about this and think, right, if we're in a situation, to quote Andy Murray, we're delivering projects at the moment by winging it. So we're using it to feel, and we're starting to really sort of think about where to take projects.
Well, I think it's worse than that. It's people winging it and these people that are winging it, they're using their gut, and they think somehow they've got this bias towards their gut being somehow special. So it's winging it with conviction, which is worse.
So this is 2x2 grid that I learned about 30 years ago, something like that. One of my first bosses said to me, look, Martin, there's a 2x2 grid and it's got competence on it and it's got enthusiasm on it. All right. So if you've got an incompetent enthusiast, that's the worst person you can have in your team. Is the best person is a competent. So in terms of some of this data at the moment, right, when it's being ignored, I don't think it's being ignored because of gut feel necessarily. It's about misaligned objectives as well.
Yeah.
So if your job as a supplier is to keep your team fed with work, then you're going to sort of manipulate the task a little bit so you can stretch it out so you can keep all your people fed. So that's just natural human behaviours. Is that aligned to the project objectives? No, it's not necessarily. So we just need to pull that out. So from my perspective, I think that's a different commercial model. And it's finding a way of keeping the bench strength sort of entertained. And that might be through different sort of commercial models, improving things for later as well.
Yeah.
So we think about HS2, for instance, it's a once through sort of rail project, and same as Crossrail, it's once through. So there's no incentive to make it better for those who follow. If we zoom out of that a little bit and say, well, if we have got bench strength because they're sat around waiting for the government to make a decision on something, right, let's start to use that bench strength to make the next project better. But that's not aligned with those objectives, and this is where it needs the leadership right at the top, is to say, this is about moving the dial on project delivery performance. It's not about that one single entity of that project.
Yeah. And it doesn't help, I suppose, especially with government projects, that we keep changing. We have the changes of governments that realigns some of the objectives, and then you lose all that fantastic work, fantastic data, because as just happened, things just get canned. But no one's going to do an inquest into what went wrong. Why, and then we'll just repeat the mistake again.
So in terms of that as well, if you look at the Crossrail data, it's really difficult to get hold of it. Really difficult. I've tried, and they fought me as well, right? So
was that the freedom of information?
So I went to see them first of all. I went to see Richard Palczynski and various other people. I went to see them. I said, "Can I get my data?" And they got me jumping through hoops and things, and said, "Well, you need to justify why you want it." And I thought, "Well, this doesn't feel right. I've got to justify everything about getting hold of the data." So I pressed the nuclear button in the end because they wouldn't give me data. So I then went to FOI requests.
Yeah. And why do you think that was? Why were they so reluctant to give you the data? Was it because they didn't want you to see it? Were they embarrassed of the quality of it? Or did they just think you were a troublemaker getting out of trouble?
So personally, I think it's because they've got sort of things to hide, and that, there's mistakes in there, which there will be, right?
Yeah,
every single project has got some sort of decisions that could have been made better through hindsight. So it's about being grown up about how we start to sort of leverage some of this data.
Yeah.
And the thing that really upsets me, James, is this is our data. It's just that government is the custodian of public data. It's not government's data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's being paid for by taxpayers' money, and we should be able to leverage it in some way.
Yeah. So what I found is that some universities can get hold of it, or some sort of organisations in a privileged situation can get hold of it, but other people can't get hold of it. And we've just got to sort of fix that problem overall, because it's an asset for all of us to learn from, to train our models and get better and better and better, and that will move the dial on project delivery performance.
Yeah. Well, what frustrates me, I mean, I agree with you on that, Martin, but what frustrates me even more than that is the same people will happily give that data away to third-party software providers, unknowingly. That's the worst bit. So
Yeah.
they're making you jump through hoops, and you're somebody who cares deeply about the profession, and we're doing it for all the right reasons. At the same time as just siphoning it off to Autodesk or to whoever, Microsoft, whoever else they were giving it to. It's that to me doesn't feel right.
And it's feeding these bigger and bigger vendors, so you get more vendor locking, etc.
Yeah,
Everything we're talking about is just open source, right? We're talking about an open source ecosystem. So it's not fully open source because you still need things like Power Apps in Microsoft land. So you've got to buy some Microsoft sort of foundations that you can build on. But once we've configured those tools, it's that sort of configuration that we give away. So some of the training of those tools, we'll give those away, etc. It's open source principles. And that's where we've got to be going, surely. So we
yeah,
can all build on the shoulders of those who's gone before. And that's what
absolutely.
we're trying to do through the apprenticeship scheme as well, is we're trying to say to people, so there's a risk in 12 months' time, 2 years' time, is that this data team's going to come along, right, in your organisation, they're going to come along and say, we've got a tool that'll do your job. So what do you do then, right? So you move to another organisation where they haven't got that tool, but that tool will then catch up with you, right? So sooner or later, you're going to become obsolete because technology starts to take you over, right? Like the typing pool back in the day, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So what do you want to do to stay in front of your peers, right? And it's not being the fastest person who's going to run away from the bear, right? You don't need to be the fastest. You just need to be in front of the people who's going to get eaten by the bear, right?
yeah,
And that's where we are with some of this. You need to get yourself in the race.
yeah,
And that's what we're trying to do with some of these things, is say to people, what can we do to start to drive this through a sort of ecosystem approach? Everybody's piling in.
yeah, yeah,
If we all pile in, we all learn about these skills, we'll then start to sort of fight with the data team and say, right, if the data team, it's your job to put the infrastructure in place. It's our job to look at the domain and the use cases and to drive this into contracts and to use it to change the way that we work. It's an enabler. It's not a technical solution in its own right.
absolutely. And for someone who's done the apprenticeship that you talked about, and I can only recommend it from a personal perspective, it does totally change your attitude. And I think that skills side of things that you offer is so important for companies. Otherwise, you will go down this route of creating these little silos, data teams, and you think they're going to solve all your problems. But it's just like we said earlier, it's just creating a problem for later. But just moving on to another question, Martin. You've been at this for quite a while now, so probably coming up for 10 years. But despite your efforts, this kind of shift to data-driven project delivery isn't maybe as widespread as you might expect. So do you feel you've fallen short of your mission, or is it just a matter of time? It's going to come, and it's just taking a bit longer than we all expect.
I've fallen short, James. I'm 56 this year, so I've only got a few years left in my career, right? I'm at the twilight of my career. So what we did with the task force, right? We got a load of people together in the task force in 2020, and we said between us is within 5 years we'll have a massive impact on the profession.
Yeah.
Between us, we've not been able to deliver that. So we need to ask why. So from my perspective, there's a load of reasons why, and we just need to keep chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. It is
And
starting to move.
what are those reasons? Just name a few of them that you think you have, because whilst you might not have fulfilled all your objectives, it's that old adage, isn't it? You aim for the stars and you reach the moon. So you've definitely made progress. But I'll be interested to hear what you think some of those reasons are.
So from my perspective, there's some big reasons, right? The biggest one is we're all too busy, right? We're all too busy working on projects. Those projects are late, so we go around trying to put fires out all the time. So we're all busy. So we lack the bandwidth. So that's number one. So I think underneath that, you've got a lack of the skills and knowledge at leadership sort of level to really understand this stuff. I think they're starting to understand it now. There's a bit of FOMO going on, Chat GPT, it's becoming more sort of familiar. It's less niche. So we were talking graph databases back in sort of 2017, and they're now starting to get, just mainstream, etc. So some of this, it just gets into the public consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think there is an education thing. The next one is about priorities. So there's drones out there. There's all the sort of, they're using things like ChatGPT to get rid of compliance challenges, etc. So there's things where they're using these capabilities to drive their business forward, right, in terms of their strategies, their business plans. and their products as well. So I've worked with some big organisations where projects are seen to be back office. So what they do is they start to take some of these capabilities and plug them into their products that they sell. Like, for instance, there's a company called Baker Hughes, and they do lots of stuff for oil and gas sector. So their pumps are all instrumented and they've got artificial intelligence embedded into them. And when I tried to talk to them about the projects, there was no investment to go into the projects because all the AI investment was going into the products, not the projects. So the projects were seen to be back office. And I think that's part of the problem, is that you're struggling to fight against these other sort of priorities across the business.
That's backwards, isn't it?
So the way that I see it is it's got to be client driven. And that's what we've got to start to do going forward, is to make sure we drive in this through some big clients. And that's the principle of the coalition now, is we've gone with some big clients like the Ministry of Defence, Sellafield, and United Utilities and EDF and Rolls-Royce and those sort of companies, right? Big clients. And they can
tell us a bit more about the coalition. What was it set up for? What's it doing?
So it's worth backtracking a little bit to 2020 when we set up the task force. So the task force was there because there was no driving force across the industry. I was trying to do my bit, but we didn't have enough horsepower behind it.
Yeah.
So we set the task force up to try and get this sort of centre of gravity around this ambition. You know, we wrote the white paper, etc. So that gave us a voice, and that gave us a voice into government, into the professional bodies, etc. So we got that going, and that has influenced various papers. So the government paper came out back in March, which was data-driven project delivery.
Yeah, we featured that heavily on this, actually. That was a great
cool.
step in the right direction.
So it's a big step in the right direction, but there's a big difference, James, between having a paper and turning that paper into reality. So back in March it was. So I went to the event in June of last year. So it was over in Belfast, and it was a 2-day event about project data analytics.
You stopped your holiday for it, didn't you, Martin?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I took a day off. So I left my wife. She was in an Airbnb. We were there for the week.
That's what you call passion, folks.
So I got myself in the doghouse a little bit, but I went to Belfast, and they invited me along for an after-dinner tour, and they told me to be punchy, which is what I was.
Yeah.
And then that paper came out 9 months later, and now we're 13 months on, and I'm struggling to see if the dial's moved as a consequence, right? So there's lots of conversations going, but so what, right? What's changing? And I'm not seeing it fast enough. And I don't know why that's not happening. I think it's back to this, you know, it's the thing about ownership and leadership and making things happen. I do see pockets of it across government, but it's not centrally coordinated. It tends to be from the advocates.
And that's why you set up the coalition, is it? To get some doing happening.
So that's where the coalition's coming. So from my perspective, is the task force has done a big chunk of its job, right? Getting the awareness out there. It's got the papers. It's got the APM skills guide, the APM's getting started guide, the government paper it's influenced, the manifesto. It's done a lot of great stuff, right? And you picking up the sort of mantle on that and you're driving it forward. You've set this podcast up, etc. It's great. It's all about getting the word out there. The thing is, we need some doers, right? We need some people who's doing this as part of their day job. So there's people from Rolls-Royce and EDF, United Utilities, etc., who have got these challenges and they're facing them today. So with United Utilities, for instance, because of the new settlement that they've got through the regulator, their investment is about to go up fourfold. Right? So they've got to spend a lot more money on projects. So from what I understand, they're going to go from 2 major suppliers, which are big JVs, to about 100 suppliers. So they've got to manage all those contracts, all those sort of KPIs around those contracts, performance, etc., etc. You can't do that by doing what you did before because it doesn't scale. So they now see that they've got a problem that they need to solve, and a good way of solving this is through advanced data analytics and artificial intelligence. So they've got a burning platform that they need to solve. So what they're going to do, they're going to take some of the apprentices, those who've been working with Projecting Success, we've been training them up. So these are project professionals who's just learning some new skills. And we're going to take them on a journey where we solve that at pace. So once that starts to scale out, we do the same thing with Rolls-Royce and EDF and the Ministry of Defence, etc. We'll then start to create all these Lego pieces of capability. So those Lego pieces would solve a point problem that we've got. And once you start to join these Lego pieces together, then you can create a Battlestar Galactica that's going to go and solve something big. That's what we're trying to do through this approach, is to open source it all as well. So when they've delivered a project, we put it out there, and then somebody else can build on the top of it. The next apprentice can build on the top of it, on the top of it, on top of it. So what does that mean for the industry? If you think about risk management, for instance, or quantity surveying, etc., we've got to be in a situation where it's no longer about using these tools as such, right? We're not talking about tools. We're now talking about what does the future of the profession look like? Where do we want to take it? And that's got to be driven by a group of people through product management concepts that's saying, this is what the future looks like, and this is the way we're going to get there. So I've been working on some of these books about next generation PMOs, next generation risk management. That sets out the lamp on the hill, right? That's the end vision for where we could be. And I've had people argue with me saying, no, that's not the future, Martin. It looks different. It's going to go slower than that. It's going to go faster, etc. I personally see that's a completely fruitless argument about who's right and who's wrong, because nobody knows till we get there.
Exactly. But the fact that you've got to start breaking it down into those little pieces and just take that first step.
It's just evidencing that as well. It's just starting to get the facts together, is that, this is what is happening currently. It's some research. This is the sort of case for change. This is where we want to be in the future. And it's a vision, right? It's a vision. Yeah. It's intended to inspire people, and then we can work with the coalition members. So with those coalition members putting their apprentices through, we can say, right, let's break those visions down into lots of different pieces. So we call that the jigsaw lid.
Yeah.
And that jigsaw lid, we then divvy it up into these little projects, these little micro projects that people can work on as part of their apprenticeship. So there's no exams on the apprenticeship. So each person's got to do 3 projects. So they can choose some of those projects. And if they choose them from the jigsaw lid, they're developing capability for the benefit of the profession, which goes on their CV. And that could be used by everybody, right? It could be used by people across the world. How cool is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very admirable, and it's exactly what we should be doing. I suppose in some ways can't understand why there's not a bigger take-up. But I think it's one of those things. It's like the old bus analogy. It will all come along at once. I think when people start realising, and having the clients that you talk about as members of the coalition, I think is incredibly powerful. And for those listening to the podcast, there is a video. If you go to our YouTube channel, there is a video of David Belshaw from Rolls-Royce and Dave Turnbull from EDF actually talking about this in a bit more detail. So I'll put that in the show notes. It's incredibly inspiring. So what you're doing, Martin, is fantastic. And I think, like you say, even if you don't get 100% the way where you want to go, you're making huge inroads and sort of changing attitudes, even if it is slower than you'd like, which I know it is. Just one more question before we wrap up, if you don't mind. Where do you see the project delivery profession, say, a decade, with the current pace of change in AI and data analytics, or whatever timescale you want to say, 5 years maybe? Where do you see the kind of, if we were sitting here in 2032 or 2034, how do you think it might look?
Completely different, James. Completely different. So from my perspective, it's about getting some breakthroughs, right? Once we get some clients who's going to run with this, those clients will make a difference. Once they start to go, it'll pull the rest of the industry with it, right? It's just trying to stimulate that Mexican wave. And I think that's what we've got with the coalition.
Yeah.
And that's largely been driven by the private sector, right? So not through government, it's largely through the private sector. So I think once the private sector starts to go with this and they demonstrate the return on investment, which I think they will, that's what will stimulate the Mexican wave. Once you demonstrate the return on investment, and that will be multifold, right? So that will be about delivering projects better, increasing project delivery confidence. So if you're going to invest in a project, you know you can deliver it for that amount of money or thereabouts, right? And it's not going to blow out. It's looking at return on investment of those projects, etc. So once we get to that, that's when this sort of Mexican wave will really get stimulated. And then when we get that stimulated, I think everybody's going to pile in, and then we'll see a massive transformational difference.
Yeah. So
stimulating that Mexican wave.
And that plus the advancement of technology, and the advancement of AI, I think those two things together, I tend to agree that I think it's going to be an incredibly different industry from the one we're working in right now. Well, that was absolutely brilliant, Martin. Thank you so much for your time. As I said, real pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I do hope you'll come back and, keep us informed.
Always available, James. Always available.
Excellent.
Always got time for you. You're a good man.
Same here, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. So
Thanks, man.
until next time, everyone, have a fantastic week.